Imagine the richest woman in New York. She owned the jewels of the French royalty, dined with the President of the United States, and gave away $200 million to charity. But in her final days, this queen was not sleeping on silk. She was found lying on a couch soaked in her own urine in a freezing room, forced to eat pureed dog food from a can. The man who turned a billionaire into a prisoner was not a stranger. It was the only son she had loved and supported for 80 years. This is not just a story about money. It is the most shocking case of elder abuse in high society history. Welcome to the tragedy of Brooke Astor. Brooke Astor was not born a victim. She was not even born an Astor. She was forged in a fire that would have melted a lesser woman trained in a school of hard knocks disguised as high society. Before she was the Queen of New York, she was a soldier's daughter who learned to march before she could dance. Her story does not begin in a ballroom. It begins in a barracks. Born Roberta Brooke Russell in 1902, she arrived at the twilight of the Victorian era, but she was never a Victorian child. Her father was John Henry Russell Jr., a career officer in the United States Marine Corps who would eventually rise to become its commandant. This is the crucial key to unlocking the psyche of Brooke Astor. She was not raised by nannies who coddled her. She was raised by a man who believed in discipline, duty, and the stiff upper lip. Her childhood was a kaleidoscope of foreign postings and military bases. While other debutantes were learning needlepoint in drawing rooms on Fifth Avenue, Brooke was riding ponies in Peking, listening to the sound of marching boots in Haiti, and navigating the rigid hierarchies of diplomatic life in Santo Domingo. She grew up transient, a nomad with impeccable manners. She learned early on that home was not a place, it was a performance. You unpacked your trunk, you put on your dress, you smiled at the general, and you never ever complained about the heat, the dust, or the fear. John Henry Russell loved his daughter, but it was a demanding, terrifying kind of love. He treated her like a recruit. He demanded perfection. If she fell off her horse, she was expected to get back on immediately, without tears. If she was frightened by the gunfire of a local revolution, she was expected to pour the tea with a steady hand. He instilled in her a philosophy she would later call gallantry, the idea that no matter how much pain you are in, you face the world with a smile and a joke. It was a magnificent armor, one that would make her the toast of New York society decades later. But armor has a flaw. It keeps the world out, but it also traps the pain in. By the time she was 16, Brooke was a creature of dazzling contradictions. She was widely read, possessed of a romantic, poetic soul that longed for great passion, yet she was encased in a shell of military stoicism. She was beautiful, with a petite frame and large, inquisitive eyes that seemed to drink in everything around her. But she was also naive. She had seen the world, but she knew nothing of the human heart. In 1919, the Russell family was stationed in Washington, D.C., and the pressure to launch Brooke into society began. The Great War was over, the Jazz Age was dawning, and the world was drunk on optimism. It was in this heady atmosphere that Brooke met the man who would turn her life into a Gothic nightmare. His name was John Dryden Cuser. He was the scion of a fabulously wealthy New Jersey family, a clan of bankers and politicians who lived in a sprawling estate that rivaled anything in The Great Gatsby. On paper, he was the catch of the century. He was handsome, rich, and socially prominent. To Brooke's parents, struggling to maintain appearances on a military salary, Cuser looked like salvation. Brooke, barely 17 and drunk on the idea of romance, was dazzled. She mistook his arrogance for confidence and his possessiveness for passion. She agreed to marry him. It was the first major decision of her life, and it was a catastrophe. The wedding took place in 1919. Brooke Russell became Mrs. John Dryden Cuser, and the steel door of the trap slammed shut. Almost immediately, the fairy tale disintegrated. The Cuser estate in Bernardsville, New Jersey was not a home, it was a fortress of gloom. The Cuser family was cold, clannish, and obsessed with money in a way that the genteel Russells were not. But the real horror was John himself. John Dryden Cuser was not just a difficult husband. He was a monster. He was a violent alcoholic, a serial adulterer, and a man possessed of a cruel, sadistic streak. For a teenage girl raised on the principles of honor and duty, his behavior was incomprehensible. The abuse began on their honeymoon. John drank heavily, ignored his young bride, and openly flirted with other women. When Brooke, confused and hurt, tried to uphold the gallantry her father had taught her, John mocked her. He found her intelligence annoying and her optimism grating. He wanted a trophy, not a partner. Back in New Jersey, the isolation was total. Brooke was stranded in a cavernous house, surrounded by servants who were loyal to the Cusers, miles away from her parents. She became a prisoner of luxury. John would disappear for days on end, returning only to berate her. He controlled the money. He controlled her movements. He broke her spirit methodically, day by day. The physical violence was the darkest secret of all. In a society where divorce was a scandal and domestic abuse was considered a private matter, Brooke had nowhere to turn. There is a harrowing account of an argument at the top of a grand staircase. John, in a drunken rage, struck her across the face with such force that he broke her jaw. Brooke fell. She lay on the floor, tasting blood, the pain blinding her. But the training of the Marine Corps daughter kicked in. She didn't call the police. She didn't run screaming into the night. She told the doctor she had fallen. She told the servants she had been clumsy. She wired her jaw shut, applied her powder, and sat at the dinner table that night, unable to eat, but sitting upright. She was 18 years old. It was into this atmosphere of terror and freezing cold that her only child was born. Anthony Dryden Cuser, the boy who would become Tony Marshall, arrived on May 30th, 1924. The birth of a child should have been a moment of redemption, but for Brooke, it was complicated by the trauma of her marriage. She was 22, exhausted, battered, and fundamentally unhappy. She looked at the baby boy in her arms and saw not just a son, but a tether that bound her even tighter to the man she hated. Brooke would later be criticized for her coldness as a mother, but we must view her through the lens of her circumstances. She was in survival mode. She had no emotional reserves left to give. She handed Tony over to the nannies just as she had been handed over, retreating into books and long walks to escape the suffocating reality of her life. She loved Tony, but it was a distant, fearful love. She associated him with the Cuser blood, the bad blood that she feared ran in his veins. John Cuser had no interest in the child. He viewed Tony as an heir, nothing more. The boy grew up in a nursery of silence, sensing the tension that vibrated through the floorboards. He watched his mother, beautiful and sad, gliding through the house like a ghost. He watched his father, loud and terrifying, smelling of whiskey. He learned early on that love was a transaction, and that safety was an illusion. For 10 years, Brooke endured. She played the part of the society wife. She hosted the parties. She wore the jewels John bought her as apologies for his affairs. She died a little more every day, but the soldier's daughter was not dead yet. Somewhere deep inside the battered psyche of Mrs. Cuser, the spirit of Brooke Russell was plotting a rebellion. The breaking point came not with a violent explosion, but with a quiet realization. In 1927, Brooke's father was promoted to High Commissioner to Haiti. Brooke traveled to visit him, taking a brief respite from her marriage. There, in the tropical heat, surrounded by men of honor who respected her father, she remembered who she was. She remembered that she was capable, intelligent, and worthy of respect. She returned to New Jersey with a new resolve. She began to quietly separate her life from John's. She started writing articles for Vogue, poetry, sketches. She started saving small amounts of money. She was preparing for a war of independence. In 1930, she did the unthinkable. She asked for a divorce. In the context of her social circle, this was a nuclear detonation. Women of her class did not divorce. They endured. They took lovers. They lived separate lives, but they did not leave. John Kuser was furious. He threatened her. He told her she would be a pariah. He told her she would be penniless. But Brooke looked at him with her broken jaw and her steel spine, and she didn't blink. She filed the papers. The divorce was messy, humiliating, and public. But when the dust settled, Brooke walked out of the Kuser estate for the last time. She was 28 years old. She had no fortune of her own. John was stingy with the settlement. She had a 6-year-old son who barely knew her. She had a reputation that was tattered by scandal. But as she stood on the pavement of New York City in the depths of the Great Depression, breathing the smoggy air of freedom, Brooke felt a strange, terrifying exhilaration. The gilded cage was open. She was bruised. She was scarred. And she was terrified. But she was free. She had survived the boot camp. Now she had to survive the war. She rented a small apartment on the Upper East Side. It was a far cry from the Bernardsville estate. She had to count her pennies. She had to learn how to budget. She took a job, yes, a job, at a decorating firm. For the first time in her life, she was a working woman. It was a humbling, frightening time, but it was also the making of her. Stripped of the Kuser millions, Brooke discovered her own currency, her charm. She discovered that she could walk into a room and light it up, not because of her diamonds, but because of her wit. She discovered that she could make people laugh. She discovered that she was, in fact, formidable. She began to build a new circle of friends, writers, artists, intellectuals, people who didn't care about her pedigree, but cared about her mind. She was reinventing herself layer by layer, turning the victim into the heroine. But the ghost of the Kuser marriage lingered. It lingered in the eyes of her son, Tony. The boy was confused by the sudden change in circumstances. He missed the big house. He missed the ponies. He resented the small apartment and the mother who was always working. He felt perhaps that he had been demoted. Brooke tried to compensate. She tried to be the mother she hadn't been in New Jersey, but the gap was already there. Tony was a Kuser, and Brooke was trying to erase the Kuser name from her life. It was a fundamental conflict that would fester for 70 years, a slow-acting poison in the bloodstream of their relationship. As 1930 turned to 1931, Brooke stood at a crossroads. She was a divorcee with a child in a city that wasn't kind to either. She needed a miracle. She needed a partner who saw her not as a possession, but as a person. She needed love, real love, the kind she had read about in her father's library but never experienced. She didn't know it yet, but the love of her life was just around the corner. And after him, the merger that would change the skyline of New York forever. The soldier's daughter had survived the battle. Now, she was ready to conquer the city. The trauma of the Kuser marriage is the foundation upon which the entire tragedy of Brooke Astor rests. It is impossible to overstate the damage inflicted during those 10 years. Brooke emerged from that marriage with a profound distrust of intimacy and a desperate need for control. She had learned that to be vulnerable was to be hurt, therefore she would never be vulnerable again. She constructed a persona, the gay, charming, unflappable Brooke, that was impenetrable. It was a mask so perfect that eventually even she forgot she was wearing it. But masks block connection. The emotional wall she built to keep John Cusack out also kept her son, Tony, out. Tony grew up watching his mother perform. He saw the gallantry that the world admired, but to a child, gallantry looks like coldness. It looks like a mother who smiles when she should be crying, who makes a joke when she should be holding you. He learned that his mother's love was a performance, and he learned to perform in return. He learned to be the good boy, the dutiful son, all while a deep, incoherent rage boiled beneath the surface. In 1930, as Brooke walked away from the wreckage of her first marriage, she thought she was leaving the darkness behind. She didn't realize that she was carrying it with her, packed in her luggage alongside her few remaining jewels, in the form of a 6-year-old boy who had learned his lessons in the Cusack house all too well. The seeds of the betrayal that would shock the world in 2006 were not sown in a Park Avenue duplex. They were sown in the silent, terrifying nursery of a New Jersey estate, watered by the tears a young mother was too proud to shed. If the first act of Brooke Astor's life was a gothic horror, the second act was a romantic comedy that tragically morphed into a corporate merger. By 1932, Brooke was a 30-year-old divorcee navigating the shark-infested waters of Depression-era New York. She had her freedom, her wit, and her son, but she lacked the one thing that guaranteed survival in her world: security. She was shabby genteel, a woman with a great name but a thin wallet, patching her silk stockings and charming her way through dinner parties where she couldn't afford to return the invitation. Then, at a dinner party that felt less like a social event and more like a lifeline, she met Charles Buddy Marshall. Buddy was everything John Cusack was not. He was not fantastically rich. He was a stockbroker who had taken a bruising in the crash of 1929, but he was rich in the things that mattered. He was kind. He was funny. He was a gentleman in the true sense of the word, not the hollow aristocratic sense. He looked at Brooke and didn't see a broken divorcee. He saw a miracle. They fell in love with a speed and intensity that startled them both. For Brooke, it was the first time she had ever felt safe with a man. Buddy didn't want to own her. He wanted to be with her. He made her laugh, not the polite social titter she had perfected, but real belly-shaking laughter. They married in 1932. It was not the society wedding of the decade. It was a quiet affair, fueled by hope rather than dynasty. And for the next 20 years, Brooke lived the only truly happy period of her personal life. The Marshall years were golden. They weren't billionaires, but they were comfortable. They bought an apartment on the Upper East Side and a country house in the Berkshires called Tyringham. They created a salon of sorts, filling their living room with writers, journalists, and the more interesting debris of the social register. Brooke blossomed. She wrote for House and Garden. She became an editor. She was a working wife, a partner, a lover. But the most significant development of this era concerned her son. Buddy Marshall did something extraordinary. He adopted Tony. John Cusack, true to his monstrous form, was happy to sign away his parental rights for a nominal fee. He washed his hands of the boy. So, Anthony Dryden Cusack became Anthony Dryden Marshall. Buddy tried to be a father. He played catch. He paid for the schools. He tried to integrate the sullen, quiet boy into this new, happy family unit. But damage is not easily undone. Tony was 8 years old when the adoption happened. He had already internalized the rejection of his biological father and the emotional distance of his mother. He watched Brooke and Buddy's happiness from the outside, a spectator to their love story. He felt perhaps like the third wheel. He was sent away to boarding schools, St. Paul's, then others. Standard practice for the class, but for Tony, It felt like another exile. He grew into a man who was technically a marshal, but spiritually still adrift. He joined the Marines, trying to emulate his famous grandfather. Searching for the discipline and approval he craved, he fought at Iwo Jima, getting wounded, earning a Purple Heart. For a brief moment, he was a hero. Brooke was proud. She wrote him letters. But when he came back, the awkwardness returned. He was a man now, stiff, formal, lacking his mother's sparkle and his stepfather's warmth. And then in 1952, the golden light went out. Buddy Marshall came home one evening complaining of indigestion. He sat down in his favorite chair and died of a massive heart attack. Brooke was 50 years old. She stood in the living room of the apartment they had built together, looking at the body of the only man she had ever truly loved, and felt the floor open up beneath her. The grief was absolute, but so was the fear. Buddy had been successful, but he hadn't left a fortune. Brooke was once again a single woman in New York, facing a future of diminishing returns. She had a little money, but not enough to maintain her life. She faced the terrifying prospect of becoming a walker, one of those elderly extra women invited to fill a seat at dinner tables, pitied and patronized. She was 50. In 1952, that was considered old. Her life was supposed to be over, but Brooke Astor did not do over. Enter Vincent Astor. If Buddy Marshall was the love of her life, Vincent Astor was the business deal of the century. Vincent was the head of the American aristocracy. His great-great-grandfather was John Jacob Astor, the man who practically invented American capitalism. Vincent sat on a pile of money so high it had its own weather system, $60 million in 1953, plus vast real estate holdings. But Vincent was miserable. He was known as Dreadful Vincent. He was physically imposing, with a towering height and a perpetually sour expression. He was suspicious, litigious, and notoriously cruel. He had been married twice, and both wives had fled. He was lonely, ailing, and looking for a nursemaid with a pedigree. He had known Brooke socially for years. He saw in her exactly what he needed: a woman of impeccable breeding who was tough enough to handle him and charming enough to fix his public image. He didn't want a lover. He wanted a chief of staff. He proposed to Brooke mere months after Buddy's death. Brooke's friends were horrified. "He's a monster," they whispered, "and he'll eat you alive. You can't marry him, Brooke. You love Buddy." Brooke listened. She knew they were right. She didn't love Vincent. She found him boorish and difficult. But she looked at her bank account. She looked at the lonely years stretching ahead, and she looked at the power Vincent wielded. Vincent was a very difficult man, she would later say with her characteristic candor, but he had a dreadful childhood. I thought I could help him. It was a lie, of course. She didn't marry him to help him. She married him to save herself. It was a cold-blooded calculation made by a survivor. She traded her freedom for the Astor name. They married in 1953. Brooke Marshall became Mrs. Vincent Astor, and the gates of the highest society slammed shut behind her. The next 5.5 years were a test of endurance that would have broken a lesser woman. The marriage was exactly as difficult as everyone predicted. Vincent was possessive to the point of paranoia. He hated going out. He hated her seeing her friends. He wanted her to sit with him in his dark, heavy mansions, listening to him complain about his health, his ex-wives, and the state of the world. He was jealous of Tony. He viewed Brooke's son as a freeloader and a rival for her attention. He was cruel to Tony, making it clear that the Astor money was not for him. "The boy has no head for business," Vincent would rumble. Brooke, caught in the middle, tried to referee, but she usually sided with Vincent. She had to. He held the purse strings. Tony now a man in his 30s with a wife and children of his own, watched this dynamic with a simmering rage. He saw his mother transforming into an Astor, adopting the airs and graces of a world that rejected him. He saw her tolerating Vincent's abuse for the sake of the money that Vincent explicitly stated Tony would never touch. But Brooke played the long game. She was a magnificent wife to Vincent. She redecorated his gloomy houses. She softened his image. She brought laughter into rooms that hadn't heard it in decades. She managed his moods with the skill of a lion tamer. She earned every single diamond he gave her. And she began to educate herself. She realized that Vincent's money was not just currency, it was a weapon. She started asking questions about his foundation, the Vincent Astor Foundation. It was a sleepy tax avoidance vehicle. Brooke saw it as something else. She saw it as an engine. "Vincent," she would say, pouring his evening martini, "wouldn't it be wonderful if we gave some money to the library?" He would grumble, but he would sign the check. He was too tired to argue, and frankly, he was enchanted by her energy. For the first time in his life, he wasn't miserable. He was content. In 1959, the inevitable happened. Vincent Astor died of a heart attack in his apartment at 120 East End Avenue. The reading of the will was the moment New York held its breath. Vincent had no children. His relatives were circling like sharks. Everyone expected the money to be tied up in trusts or given to distant cousins. But Vincent had done something shocking. In his final years, he had come to trust Brooke completely. He realized she was the only person who had ever actually cared for him, or at least performed the role so perfectly he couldn't tell the difference. He left the bulk of his fortune in the Vincent Astor Foundation, putting Brooke in charge of how it would be spent, while also providing her with substantial personal assets, income from a large trust, cash, and the houses and jewels. She was 57 years old. She was the widow of the richest man in New York. She had absolute power. The lawyer looked at her across the mahogany table. "Well, Brooke," he said, "what are you going to do now?" Brooke stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her black Chanel suit. Her eyes, usually so merry, were steel. "I'm going to have a good time," she said. And she didn't mean parties. She meant power. The metamorphosis was complete. The soldier's daughter had survived the brutal first marriage. The lover had enjoyed the golden interlude. The survivor had endured the billionaire's bargain. Now the queen was ready to ascend the throne. But in the shadow of the throne, the crown prince was waiting. Tony Marshall was now the son of one of the richest women in the world. He expected his turn. He expected the tap to open. He didn't realize that his mother had no intention of handing him the keys to the kingdom. She had earned this money with her blood and her pride. It was hers, and she was going to give it all away to New York. The will of Vincent Astor contained a poison pill that few noticed at the time, but which would eventually kill the family. Vincent hated Tony Marshall. He made sure that his stepson received almost nothing. There was no trust fund, no seat on the board of the foundation, no validation. Brooke could have rectified this. She had the power to bring Tony into the fold, to give him a role in the foundation, to make him her partner in philanthropy. But she didn't. Why? Perhaps she respected Vincent's wishes too much. Perhaps she truly believed Tony was incompetent. He had a string of failed business ventures behind him. Or perhaps deep down, she wanted the glory for herself. She had spent 60 years serving men. Her father, John Cuser, Buddy Marshall, Vincent Astor. She was done sharing the spotlight. This exclusion was the wound that never healed. Tony watched his mother become Saint Brooke, the savior of the city, pouring millions into the Bronx Zoo and the Morgan Library, while he had to ask her for an allowance. He saw her treating the city's poor with infinite compassion, while treating him with a cheerful, check-writing distance. He began to view the foundation's money not as charity, but as his stolen inheritance. Every dollar she gave to the New York Public Library was a dollar taken from him, the resentment calcified into a diamond-hard hatred. He would wait. He would play the good son, but he would get what was his. As Brooke stepped out into the 1960s, a widow with a checkbook and a mission, she thought she was free. She didn't see the shadow stretching out behind her, getting longer with every passing year. On November 28, 1966, the Plaza Hotel in New York City became the center of the universe. Truman Capote, fresh from the triumph of In Cold Blood, was hosting his legendary black and white ball. It was the party of the century, a masquerade where the masks were designed to reveal more than they hid. In a ballroom filled with swans, Capote's collection of impossibly chic, wealthy women like Babe Paley and Slim Keith, Brooke Astor arrived. She wore a gown of white silk, a diamond necklace that could have ransomed a small country, and a mask encrusted with jewels. But she didn't just float through the room, she anchored it. While the other swans were decorative, neurotic creatures dependent on their husbands' fortunes and Capote's flattery, Brooke was different. She was a sovereign state. At 64 years old, she was in the prime of her power. She danced, she drank champagne, she charmed Frank Sinatra, but there was a steeliness to her gaiety. While Babe Paley worried about her husband's affairs, Brooke Astor was worrying about the boiler in a settlement house on the Lower East Side. She left the party at a reasonable hour because the next morning the Queen had work to do. This era, from 1960 to roughly 1990, was the reign of Brooke. It was a period of frantic, joyful activity where she redefined what it meant to be a wealthy woman in America. Vincent Astor had left her a mission to spend the money, and Brooke attacked that mission with the tactical precision of her Marine father. She famously declared, "Money is like manure. It's not worth a thing unless it's spread around encouraging young things to grow." She turned the Vincent Astor Foundation into a velvet steamroller. She didn't want to be a distant donor, a name on a plaque. She wanted to be a participant. She created a new archetype, the hands-on philanthropist. Her routine became the stuff of legend. She would dress in her armor, the Chanel suit, the hat, the white kidskin gloves, the pearls, and climb into her Mercedes. But she didn't head to Fifth Avenue. She headed to the Bronx. She headed to Bed-Stuy. She headed to the crumbling tenements of Harlem. She visited everywhere the police told her not to go, from drug rehabilitation centers, smelling of bleach, to crumbling libraries in Harlem. Everywhere she went, she brought a strange, transformative energy. She didn't patronize. She didn't flinch. When she walked into a homeless shelter, she shook hands with the residents, looking them in the eye. She asked sharp forensic questions about the plumbing, the heating, the food budget. She kicked tires. She checked the foundations. There is a famous story of her visiting a housing project in the South Bronx. The elevator was broken. The stairs were littered with trash and drug paraphernalia. Her handlers tried to steer her away. Brooke simply tightened her grip on her purse, lifted the hem of her couture skirt, and marched up 6 flights of stairs. When she arrived at the community center at the top, not a hair was out of place. She looked at the stunned director and said, "Now tell me what you need." She gave away nearly $200 million. She revitalized the New York Public Library, turning it from a decaying relic into a vibrant cultural hub. She saved the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Temple of Dender, but her heart was always with the Crown Heights Youth Collective, or the Bronx Zoo. She loved the city, not just the shiny parts, but the gritty, broken, striving parts. And the city loved her back. Construction workers would whistle at her limousine. "Hey, Brooke," they would shout. She would roll down the window and wave like royalty. She was Mrs. Astor, a title that commanded more respect in New York than Mr. President. But while she was mothering 8 million New Yorkers, she was failing the one man who called her mother. The tragedy of Toni Marshall during these years is a study in emasculation. While Brooke was soaring, Toni was sinking. He was a man in his 40s and 50s trying desperately to carve out an identity separate from the Astor millions, yet entirely dependent on them. He had a series of careers that looked impressive on paper but were hollow in reality. He worked for the CIA. He became an ambassador to the Malagasy Republic and later Trinidad and Tobago. These diplomatic posts were victories for Toni, but Brooke had a way of turning them into humiliations. She would visit him at his embassy. She would sweep in, charm the local dignitaries, reorganize the household, and dazzle the press. Toni would be reduced to a supporting player in his own residency. The local papers would rave about Mrs. Astor's visit, while the ambassador stood silently in the background. He was the eternal Prince Charles, waiting for a queen who refused to age. His personal life was equally messy. He divorced his first wife, had a second marriage that failed, and was generally viewed by New York society as a dull stick. He was grumpy, entitled, and lacked his mother's sparkle. He was a accuser, not a Russell. The financial dynamic was poisonous. Brooke was giving away millions to strangers, but Toni had to ask for his allowance. She paid him a salary to manage her finances, a job he performed with questionable skill, but she made it clear that the money was hers. She used money as a leash. When Toni was good, the leash was loose. When he annoyed her, it tightened. "Toni is so heavy," she would confess to her friends, rolling her eyes. "He has no sense of fun." It was a devastating critique. In Brooke's world, being boring was a cardinal sin. She surrounded herself with the wittiest people on earth: Oscar de la Renta, Henry Kissinger, Barbara Walters. Toni, with his complaints about money and his sullen demeanor, was a buzzkill at the party of her life. And then the catalyst arrived. In 1992, at the age of 68, Toni married for the third time. Her name was Charlene Gilbert. If Brooke was the heroine of this story, Charlene was cast by New York society as the villain. She was the wife of a local vicar whom Toni had met and fallen for. She left the vicar. Toni left his second wife. They married. Brooke despised her. To Brooke, Charlene was a social climber of the worst kind. She was that woman. She found Charlene lacking in taste, breeding, and humor. When Toni brought her to tea, Brooke would be icily polite, offering her a biscuit as if feeding a stray dog. "She has no neck," Brooke famously whispered to a friend, "and she dresses like a disco ball." But Charlene was not just ambitious. She was a predator. While Brooke Astor lay shivering in a torn nightgown, smelling of neglect, Charlene was walking around New York wearing Brooke's favorite pearl earrings and using the Astor fortune as her personal credit card. She whispered poison into Toni's ear, convincing him that his mother's charity was actually theft from them. She whispered in his ear that his mother didn't respect him, that she was robbing him of his birthright. Together, Toni and Charlene formed a united front of grievance. They watched as Brooke, now in her 90s, continued to spend. They calculated the dwindling inheritance. Every million given to the Bronx Zoo was a million that wouldn't buy Charlene a new fur coat or Toni a new boat. As the millennium approached, a terrifying shift began to occur. Brooke was invincible, but she was human. In her late 90s, the magnificent engine began to misfire. The sharp memory began to slip. She would tell a story, then tell it again 10 minutes later. She would forget names. She would get lost in her own apartment. Alzheimer's disease is a slow, cruel thief. It doesn't steal the person all at once, it erodes them. For a woman like Brooke, whose entire identity was built on her intellect and her social grace, the confusion was terrifying. She tried to hide it. She relied on her gallantry. She would smile and nod when she didn't understand the conversation. She would use her charm to cover the gaps. But Tony saw the gaps, and he saw his opening. He began to insert himself more aggressively into her affairs. He told her she was confused. He told her she couldn't handle the checkbook anymore. He fired her longtime advisors, the men who had protected her money for decades, and replaced them with his own cronies. He convinced her to give him power of attorney. "It's just to help you, Mother," he surely said. "You don't want to worry about the bills." Brooke, frightened by the fog descending on her mind, trusted him. He was her son. He was her flesh and blood. The Marine's daughter had been trained to withstand enemy fire, but she had never been trained to withstand a betrayal from within the perimeter. By her 100th birthday party in 2002, that glittering event at the Rockefeller estate, the trap was already set. The guests saw the legend. They saw the diamonds. They didn't see that Brooke had been medicated to ensure she was compliant. They didn't see that Tony was hovering at her elbow, controlling who spoke to her. They didn't know that the famous Astor apartment on Park Avenue, once the most beautiful home in New York, was beginning to fray at the edges because Tony was cutting the housekeeping budget. The Queen was still on the throne, but the regent was already looting the treasury. The final years of the reign were a masquerade more elaborate than Capote's ball. To the public, Mrs. Astor was still the Grand Dame, receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Bill Clinton, smiling for the cameras. But in private, she was a frightened old woman, isolated from her friends, dependent on a son who viewed her longevity not as a blessing, but as an obstacle. She had spent her life giving everything away. Now she was about to lose the only thing she had left, her dignity and her freedom. As the curtain fell on her first century of life, Brooke Astor looked out at the city she loved, the city she had saved, and didn't realize that the city was oblivious to her own desperate need for rescue. She was the woman who had everything, and she was about to discover that having everything makes you the perfect target for those who have nothing but greed. The velvet steamroller had run out of fuel. The wolves were at the door, and the leader of the pack had a key. There is a tragic irony in the way Brooke Astor structured her philanthropy. She believed in what is known as a sunset provision. She wanted the Vincent Astor Foundation to spend all its money and close its doors during her lifetime, or shortly after. She didn't want a perpetual endowment managed by bureaucrats. She wanted the joy of giving it away herself. "I want to die broke," she would joke. Tony Marshall heard this, and it terrified him. He took her joke literally. He realized that if she lived to be 105 or 110, she might actually succeed. She might spend every dime. The inheritance he had waited 70 years for, the reward for all the humiliations, the boarding schools, the coldness, would evaporate into the coffers of the New York Public Library. This fear was the engine of the abuse. It wasn't just cruelty, it was a race against time. Tony needed to secure the assets before she gave them away. He needed to stop the flow of charity. He needed to declare her incompetent not to protect her, but to protect his future fortune. And so the greatest philanthropist in New York history became the victim of her own generosity. Her desire to give became the justification for her son to take. In the twisted logic of Tony and Charlene, they were not stealing. They were salvaging the wreckage of a fortune that a senile old woman was recklessly throwing away on the poor. 778 Park Avenue is one of the most exclusive addresses in the world. It is a limestone fortress of wealth, a place where the elevators opened directly into foyers, marble-floored and silent, and where the outside world is kept at bay by white-gloved doormen. For 40 years, Brooke Astor's duplex apartment on the 15th floor was the pulsating heart of New York society. Presidents dined there. Literary lions roared there. It was a temple of light, filled with fresh flowers, impressionist paintings, and the sound of Brooke's laughter. But by 2003, the temple had become a tomb. The descent was not sudden. It was a slow, suffocating constriction. As Brooke's Alzheimer's advanced, robbing her of her sharp judgment and her ability to advocate for herself, Tony Marshall moved to seal the perimeter. He understood that to loot the treasury, he first had to remove the guards. The guards were Brooke's loyal staff. These were not just employees, they were her family. Her butler, Chris Ellie, her housekeeper, her maid, these people loved her. They brushed her hair. They held her hand when she was confused. They protected her dignity. And crucially, they saw everything. Tony fired them. One by one, the familiar faces vanished. He claimed it was too expensive to keep them on. He claimed Brooke didn't need them. He replaced them with cheaper agency aides who didn't know Brooke, didn't care about her legacy, and were less likely to ask questions. With the witnesses gone, the isolation became total. Tony gave orders to the doorman, no visitors without his permission. The phone list was pruned. Friends who had called Brooke every week for 30 years, Annette de la Renta, David Rockefeller, Barbara Walters, were told she was too tired or sleeping. Brooke Astor, the most connected woman in New York, was now living on a desert island in the sky. Inside the apartment, the conditions deteriorated with shocking speed. It was a Grey Gardens scenario playing out in the richest zip code in America. Tony, obsessed with saving money, slashed the household budget to the bone. The fresh flowers stopped coming. The heating was turned down to save on oil bills, leaving the fragile centenarian shivering in her shawls. The magnificent curtains, once the talk of Architectural Digest, grew dusty and tattered. But the personal degradation was the most agonizing part. The woman who had been the epitome of elegance, who wouldn't be caught dead without her lipstick, was now left to languish. She slept on a couch in the library that was stained with urine because Tony refused to pay for proper cleaning or medical equipment. She wore torn nightgowns. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, was unkempt. Her diet became a source of horror. The chef was gone. Tony Marshall, a millionaire many times over, forced his mother to eat pureed peas and oatmeal. There were reports of cheap processed food being served to a woman whose estate was valued at nearly $200 million. Why? It wasn't just greed. It was punishment. It was a grim, subconscious revenge for a lifetime of feeling inferior. By reducing the Queen of New York to a helpless, disheveled old woman dependent on his charity, Tony was finally the one in power. He was the parent. She was the child. While Brooke withered, Tony and Charlene thrived. They treated the apartment as their own personal ATM. Tony increased his salary for managing her affairs to a staggering sum. They used her drivers, her summer house in Maine, her connections. Charlene, the woman Brooke had called a disco ball, was now wearing Brooke's jewels, draping herself in the Astor legacy while the actual Astor lay confused in a dark room. The financial looting was systemic. Tony, using his power of attorney, began to sell off her beloved paintings. The Childa Hassam flag painting, Brooke's favorite, was sold for $10 million. Tony took a $2 million commission on the sale. But the ultimate goal was the will. Brooke's 1997 will was clear. The bulk of her estate was to go to charity. Tony was to receive a generous income, but not the capital. This was the sunset provision. The money was for New York. Tony needed to change that. Between 2002 and 2004, a series of codicils were made to her will. The scene described by witnesses is chilling. A lawyer would be brought in. Brooke, confused, frightened, and often medicated, would be presented with papers. Tony would hover over her. "Sign here, mother," he would say. "It's for the best. We need to save money." "What is it?" she would ask, her voice trembling. "I don't understand." Brooke looked at him. The dementia had fogged her mind, but the fear was crystal clear. She was terrified that if she refused, he would leave her alone in the dark forever. This was psychological torture, gaslighting at its most cruel. So she signed. With a shaky hand, she signed away millions of dollars intended for the New York Public Library and redirected them to Anthony Marshall. She signed away her legacy. It was elder abuse weaponized by contract law. The conspiracy of silence might have held forever. Society people, as a rule, do not get involved in domestic squabbles. It's a family matter, they say, averting their eyes. But there was one Marshall who was not like the others. Philip Marshall was Tony's son, Brooke's grandson. He was a professor of historic preservation, a quiet, intellectual man who lived in Vermont. He had no interest in high society, but he adored his grandmother. She had been the magical figure of his childhood, the one who took him on adventures, who listened to him. Philip began to notice the changes. When he visited New York, he saw the fear in his grandmother's eyes when his father entered the room. He saw the stained couch. He saw the torn nightgown. One afternoon, he sat with her in the kitchen. She was eating meager food. She looked at him, her eyes momentarily clearing, and whispered, "Am I poor?" It broke his heart. The woman who had given away $200 million was terrified she couldn't afford bread. Philip tried to talk to his father. Tony dismissed him. "She's fine," Tony snapped. "She's old. This is what happens." Philip knew it wasn't true. He knew this wasn't age, it was neglect. He faced an agonizing moral precipice. To save his grandmother, he would have to destroy his father. He would have to expose the family's shame to the world. He would have to blow up the Astor name. He didn't act alone. He reached out to the one person he knew had the steel to help him, Annette de la Renta. Annette was the wife of the designer Oscar de la Renta and Brooke's closest friend. She was elegant, tough, and fiercely loyal. When Philip told her what was happening, she didn't hesitate. She had been trying to see Brooke for months and had been blocked by Tony. Now she knows why. They formed a war council. They gathered affidavits. They tracked down the fired staff. Chris Ellie, the butler, gave a tearful, damning statement about the conditions in the apartment. They spoke to David Rockefeller, the patriarch of the establishment, who gave his blessing. They were preparing to do the unthinkable, sue Anthony Marshall for the guardianship of his mother. In July 2006, the nuclear option was deployed. Philip Marshall filed a petition in New York State Supreme Court, alleging that his father was neglecting Brooke Astor's care and looting her estate. The petition quickly leaked into the press, splashed across the tabloids, before a judge moved to seal the court records in a futile attempt to stuff the scandal back into the bottle. On July 26, 2006, the New York Daily News ran the headline that shook the sidewalk. "Ah, disaster for Mrs. Astor." The story exploded. It was front-page news around the world. The details, the urine-stained couch, the pureed peas, the cheap nightgowns, were devoured by a public that couldn't reconcile these images with the glamour of Brooke Astor. It was a scandal that mixed the wealth of the great Gatsby with the horror of King Lear. Tony Marshall was blindsided. He denied everything. He claimed he was a loving son, that his mother was happy, that Philip was a disgruntled grandson looking for money. But the court didn't wait. A judge appointed a temporary guardian and ordered an immediate inspection of the apartment. When the court-appointed evaluator entered 778 Park Avenue, the truth was laid bare. It was exactly as Philip had described. A dark, sad place where a legend was fading away in squalor. The rescue operation began immediately. Tony was stripped of his control over her medical and personal care. Annette de la Renta was named her guardian. The first thing Annette did was bring back the light. She rehired Chris Ely, the beloved butler. She brought in fresh flowers. She opened the curtains. She bought Brooke new nightgowns. She called the best doctors. There's a moment of profound grace recorded during this time. When Chris Ely walked back into the apartment after being banned for years, Brooke, despite her dementia, looked up. Her eyes lit up with recognition. "Chris," she said, "where have you been?" She thought he had been on vacation. She didn't know he had been fired, but she knew she was safe again. The prisoner of Park Avenue was free, but the war was far from over. The civil suit was just the opening skirmish. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office was watching. They saw more than neglect. They saw a crime scene. They saw grand larceny, forgery, and fraud. As Brooke settled into a peaceful twilight, surrounded by the people who actually loved her, the legal machinery was turning its sights on Tony. The son who had wanted everything was about to face the one thing his money couldn't buy off: a jury of his peers. The filing of the lawsuit by Philip Marshall did more than save Brooke Astor. It broke a massive societal taboo. Elder abuse was something that happened in other families, poor families, desperate families. It didn't happen on Park Avenue. It didn't happen to the Astors. By dragging the ugly truth into the light, Philip Marshall forced a national conversation. He showed that abuse isn't always physical. It is financial, emotional, and psychological. He showed that isolation is a weapon, and he showed that money is no shield against cruelty. The image of Brooke Astor on that stained couch became a symbol of vulnerability. It terrified people. If the Queen of New York could be reduced to this, who was safe? But amidst the horror, there was a triumph of love. Philip Marshall gained nothing financially from his actions. In fact, he risked being disinherited completely. He did it for love. In a story defined by greed, his action was the pure, shining counterweight. He proved that the gallantry Brooke Astor valued so highly had skipped a generation, landing safely in the heart of her grandson. In the summer of 2006, a strange and beautiful silence descended upon the estate known as Holly Hill. Located in Briarcliff Manor just north of New York City, it was Brooke Astor's country sanctuary, a place of rolling lawns, English gardens, and cool stone terraces. For the previous few years, Tony Marshall had largely forbidden his mother from visiting Holly Hill, claiming it was too expensive to open the house. He had shut it down, leaving the dust sheets on the furniture, while Brooke languished in the sweltering heat of the city. But after the explosive intervention of Philip Marshall and the court order that stripped Tony of his power, the gates of Holly Hill were thrown open once more. Annette de la Renta, Brooke's guardian angel, orchestrated the return. The house was aired out, the gardens were manicured, and Brooke Astor, frail but finally free, was brought home. Her final year was a grace note. The dementia had taken most of her memories, but it had not taken her capacity for joy. She sat on her terrace wrapped in cashmere watching the birds. She held hands with her loyal butler, Chris Ely. She was surrounded by fresh flowers and the people who loved her not for her checkbook, but for her soul. She didn't know that back in Manhattan, a grand jury was convening. She didn't know that the district attorney, Robert Morgenthau, was methodically building a case against her son. She didn't know that her name was still on the front page of every newspaper, a symbol of a scandal that had shaken the city to its bedrock. In her mind, the war was over. She was just a girl again, back in the garden, safe from the noise. On August 13th, 2007, Brooke Astor died at Holly Hill. She was 105 years old. The news traveled instantly across the globe. The last great lady is gone. The tributes were effusive. Flags at institutions she had championed, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, were lowered to half-staff in her honor. The lights of Broadway should have dimmed, for she had been the city's greatest patron. Her funeral at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue was the final gathering of the tribe. It was a state funeral in all but name. The pews were filled with Rockefellers, Kissingers, and Clintons. The air was thick with incense and the unspoken tension of a family at war. Tony Marshall was there. He walked up the aisle, leaning on a cane, his face a mask of stone. He was the chief mourner, the only son. But as he passed the pews, the temperature in the church seemed to drop. People looked at him, then looked away. He was a pariah in his own world. He stood by the casket of the mother he had neglected, playing the role of the grieving son one last time. But everyone knew the truth. The indictment was coming. 4 months after the funeral, the other shoe dropped. Anthony Marshall was indicted by a Manhattan grand jury on charges of grand larceny, criminal possession of stolen property, forgery, and scheming to defraud. The Queen was dead, but her ghost was about to take the witness stand. The trial of Anthony Marshall, which began in the spring of 2009, was the final grotesque spectacle of the Astor saga. It was held in a dingy courtroom in downtown Manhattan, a far cry from the gilded ballrooms of Park Avenue. It was the ultimate clash between the old world of polite society and the cold, hard reality of criminal law. It was a parade of the elite. One by one, the icons of New York society were called to testify. Henry Kissinger took the stand. Barbara Walters took the stand. They were asked uncomfortable forensic questions about Brooke's mental state. Did she know what she was signing? Did she recognize you? Did she seem afraid? The testimony painted a devastating picture. The jury heard how Tony had fired the staff. They heard about the codicils signed in secret. They heard about the sale of the Childa Hassam painting where Tony had pocketed a $2 million commission, money that belonged to his mother. But the most damning witness wasn't a celebrity. It was the handwriting expert. The prosecution showed the signatures on the codicils that changed Brooke's will. They were shaky, spider-like scrawls, barely legible. They compared them to Brooke's signature from her prime, the bold, confident copperplate script of a woman in charge. The visual evidence of her decline and Tony's exploitation of it was heartbreaking. Tony's defense was weak. His lawyers tried to argue that Brooke was lucid, that she wanted to give Tony the money, that Philip Marshall was the real villain. They tried to paint Tony as a war hero and a devoted son who was being persecuted by his mother's snobbish friends. But the jury looked at Tony Marshall, sullen, entitled, and seemingly remorseless, and they didn't see a victim. They saw a man who had waited 80 years for an inheritance and decided to steal it when the waiting got too long. On October 8th, 2009, the verdict was read. Anthony Marshall, the son of Brooke Astor, the stepson of Vincent Astor, the former ambassador, was a convicted felon. He was convicted of grand larceny in the first degree. The penalty was prison. It was a shock wave. In the rarefied world of the Upper East Side, people like Tony Marshall didn't go to prison. They settled, they paid fines, they went away quietly. But the jury had sent a message. You cannot steal from the vulnerable, even if the vulnerable person is your own mother. The sentencing was delayed for years due to appeals and Tony's failing health, a strategy that many noted was ironic, given how little sympathy he had shown for his mother's failing health. But finally, in June 2013, at the age of 89, Tony Marshall went to prison. There is a grim symmetry to it. He was sent to a medical facility in the prison system. He wore a uniform. He was stripped of his name and his status. He served only 8 weeks before being granted medical parole, but the point had been made. He died in 2014, a disgraced man, disinherited not by his mother's will, but by his own actions. And what of the money? This is the final triumph of Brooke Astor. Despite Tony's desperate attempts to rewrite the will, the settlement reached after the trial restored the original intent of her 1997 will. Tony's eventual inheritance was slashed to a fraction of what he'd expected, roughly in the low tens of millions, while the bulk of the remaining estate finally went where Brooke had always intended, to New York's libraries, museums, and parks. It went to the New York Public Library. It went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It went to the Bronx Zoo. It went to the parks, the schools, and the playgrounds of New York City. Even from the grave, the velvet steamroller had crushed the opposition. Today, if you walk through New York, you are walking through Brooke Astor's legacy. When you sit in the reading room of the library, under the golden light, you are her guest. When you walk through the Temple of Dinder, you are in her house. But the most profound legacy is not in the stone and the marble. It is in the precedent. The Brooke Astor law doesn't exist by name, but her case changed the way we look at elder abuse. It sensitized bank tellers, lawyers, and doormen to the signs of exploitation. It taught us that gallantry is not enough. Sometimes you need protection. Brooke Astor was the last of her kind. She represented a world of white gloves and handwritten notes of duty and decorum, but she was also a thoroughly modern warrior. She fought her way out of a brutal first marriage. She fought her way into the center of American power. And in the end, through the proxy of her grandson and her friends, she fought her way out of the darkness of elder abuse. She was the Queen of New York. But she was also Roberta Brooke Russell, the Marine's daughter, who learned early on that when you fall off your horse, you get back on. And when she finally rode off into the sunset, she left the city a little brighter, a little kinder, and a little more beautiful than she found it. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that captures the essence of Brooke Astor's spirit better than any plaque. Years before the darkness descended, Brooke was hosting a dinner party. The conversation turned to the afterlife. Someone asked her what she wanted on her tombstone. She thought for a moment, her eyes twinkling with that famous mischief. "I had a wonderful time," she said. It was a lie, of course. She had endured abuse, loneliness, grueling marriages, and a final terrible betrayal. She had wept tears no one saw. She had been lonely in crowded rooms. But it was also the truth. Because Brooke Astor decided that life was a performance and the show must go on. She decided to be happy, even when she wasn't. She decided to be generous, even when the world took from her. She decided to be kind, even when she was surrounded by cruelty. The tragedy of her final years was that the audience was removed and the lights were turned out. She was left alone on the stage with the one person who hated the play. But thanks to the courage of a grandson who refused to look away, the lights were turned back on for the curtain call. And when she finally took her bow, she did it on her own terms, surrounded by love, restored to dignity, and leaving the audience asking for more.